Violence is a rarity in hauntings. Contrary to the archetypal, hair-raising Hollywood scenes that dominate our screens, true instances of the paranormal are usually much more subtle, less apparent, and involve far fewer physical manifestations. Usually. After all, once in a while, a rare case will be documented where the happenings are said to be not merely unearthly, but incredibly corporeal, with those who experience them reporting everything from being touched by unseen hands to being attacked by discarnate entities. Such was the case in the San Pedro Haunting, which in the late 1980s saw a single mother and her children forced out of their home after a series of events that can only be described as horrific led to those who investigated them claiming that had things ended differently, they would not have left the house alive. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. From time to time, we all enjoy being spooked. We relish the skin prickles and embrace those delicious, uneasy flutters in our heart and stomach. From a safe and comfortable distance, of course. And so perhaps you are watching this in bed or on the sofa, tucked up with your favourite blanket and pillow. And so, before we begin, please allow this brief interlude for me to discuss the sponsor of today's video, Blissy. Blissy offers silk pillowcases which give you better hair, better skin, and incredible sleep, even after indulging in spooks and spectres. Designed by a team of experts, their pillowcases are 100% mulberry silk, a natural and hypoallergenic material that is pure bliss. As well as being incredibly luxurious both to look at and to touch, as silk naturally has low heat conductivity, Blissy's pillowcases help to regulate your body temperature, being cool to the touch and thus perfect for those restless summer nights when you have trouble sleeping. And for me personally, in addition to waking up refreshed after a deep sleep, another thing that I love about this pillowcase is that it is hair and skin friendly. Unlike cotton alternatives, Blissy silk pillowcases are so sensationally smooth, they reduce hair breakage while you sleep, with no toxic chemicals or dyes being used in their production. Being so high quality, these pillowcases make wonderful gifts for any occasion, most especially for weddings, anniversaries, and birthdays. Their dream sets in particular are presented magnificently. I truly cannot imagine a more beautiful gift for a bride-to-be or treasured spouse. Blissy also offers a range of other products which are just as heavenly, such as silk hair scrunchies, sleep masks, and even all-natural pillow mists carefully designed to treat your senses and tell your brain that it's time for sleep. In addition to kindly sponsoring this video, Blissy are also offering an additional 30% off my viewers' orders. All you have to do is visit blissy.com/paranormal scholar or click the link below. Restore your energy, sleep better, and even improve your hair and skin with a Blissy silk pillowcase. That's blissy.com/paranormal scholar, or simply click the link below with the code automatically applied at checkout for an additional 30% off and free worldwide shipping. Thank you. Now on with the video. It was the autumn of 1988, and a 23-year-old Jackie Hernandez was seeking a fresh start. Recently separated from her husband Elle, she and her young son Jamie moved into a small house in San Pedro, California. Jackie was pregnant at the time, and despite being overworked, holding down multiple jobs, all while studying in the evenings, she was optimistic. For the first time in her life, she felt comfortable being alone. Strangely, it even felt as though someone unseen, was watching over her. There was, she could only conclude, a presence in the house. Quite early on, Jackie confided this in her neighbour, an affable woman by the name of Susan Castaneda. Susan, by her own admission, did not attribute any of her neighbour's early reports to anything paranormal. Rather, she saw them as proof of Jackie's swelling self-confidence, a young mother out in the world by herself for the first time. And yet, as time went by, the phenomena that Jackie reported grew beyond the feeling of being watched. She would hear strange noises, inexplicable bangs and bumps, footsteps coming from the attic above her, and tiny pebbles falling down the inside of her walls. On one occasion, she even witnessed a pencil holder fly over and off a desk without anyone having touched it. The presence, so it seemed, was evolving into something physical. In the decades since these happenings, Jackie has spoken at length about all that she experienced in the San Pedro house. For example, in a 1997 documentary titled An Unknown Encounter, she describes how, in February 1989, she entered her children's bedroom and saw the full-bodied apparition of an old man seated on her son's bunk bed. "He looks like he's a corpse," she explained to the interviewer at the time. "He's got a greyish tone to him, and he's wearing a red flannel shirt. His shirt's tucked in, his pants are high water." Jackie was terrified. Another story which stands out involves a picture frame, being memorable not merely for how it was witnessed and thus corroborated by her neighbour Susan, but for how it can be said to have hinted at the violence to come. One evening when Susan was visiting so as to check on Jackie, as had become her habit, the two women are said to have heard a big bang coming from the kitchen. When they investigated, they supposedly found a large painting that had until that point been hanging on the wall, propped against the sink. Not merely that, the nails which kept it secured to the wall had been removed and placed so that they were standing perfectly on their heads, sharp points facing upward. With it not being possible for the painting and its nails to have fallen in such a way, Jackie and Susan were convinced that someone or something must have pulled it from the wall. And so the atmosphere in the San Pedro house had well and truly changed. No longer did Jackie think she was being watched over by a benevolent force. Rather, she was fearful and worried that whoever was in the house with her had intentions very different from those which she had initially assumed. After all, she had a young child and another on the way. She did not want them exposed to whatever seemed to be skulking in the shadows, most especially the man she had seen on her son's bed. Yet, when Jackie had babysitters around at the house to watch over Jamie, and later her daughter Samantha as well, they too reported peculiar happenings in and around the children's bedroom. One claimed to have experienced some sort of distortion, with the distance from the living room to the bedroom seeming to stretch before her very eyes. Another, a then 16-year-old Tina Lawler, stated that the door to the room opened by itself whenever she went to check on Jackie's sleeping son, almost as though someone was already in the bedroom with him. Speaking about this in a 2012 episode of Paranormal Witness, Tina also describes observing a series of strange lights on the ceiling of Jackie's kitchen. Neither she nor Jackie, who was also present, had ever seen anything like them before. There was, so Tina claimed, substance to them. Fortunately, Jackie was able to photograph the peculiar lights, not once but twice. Before too long, the highly luminous objects in the kitchen became a regular occurrence, with another friend called Chrissy Zikovi also observing them. Jackie was again able to photograph the lights, with the photo lab who analysed the prints afterwards concluding that they were not merely genuine images, but highly irregular as well, with the patterns and lights of the objects not matching what should be in a print like this. According to Jackie, they were like little jelly balls and would divide and go back together, going around and around and around real fast. It is here that one starts to get a sense of the impressiveness of the San Pedro haunting. In addition to the high number of witnesses, each willing and indeed able to express in a compelling manner the phenomena which they experienced, the case is also remarkably well documented. Relatively early on, Jackie Hernandez thought to keep a record of what was happening in her home. And yet, one must not confuse this for eagerness to share her experiences. Rather, Jackie, as she has explained more freely as time has passed since the original events, was just as terrified of being judged for her experiences as she was of the experiences themselves. Aside from confiding in her female friends, including her neighbor Susan, Jackie was doing her best to carry on with her life in spite of all that was happening at home. After all, when she attempted to share her fears with her ex-husband Al, who she was still on good terms with, he was initially unsupportive and thought that she was trying to draw attention to the fact that she was alone. As far as he was concerned, there was something wrong with her and not the house. And so it was very unsettling for Jackie when Susan revealed to her landlord that she had been having trouble at home. He, however, seemed affected by her situation and arranged for 2 priests to come and visit. However, according to Jackie's 2012 testimony, she had a bad feeling about them from the moment they entered the house. Cynical and judgmental, they are said to have accused her of having brought death into her house, for having an ornament of a skull in her aquarium. They picked through her belongings and even suggested that her son, who began to cry during their visit, was possessed by the devil. After blessing both him and Jackie's unborn daughter, they left, with the social worker arriving on her doorstep the very next day, responding to a complaint made by the priests. They had told Child Protective Services that she had been on hallucinogenics whilst pregnant. This was a wake-up call for Jackie. Perhaps things were better left unsaid, because you never know what can happen if you tell people. Thus, by the summer of 1989, Jackie was struggling. Alone and with a newborn baby to care for, she was financially trapped in a home where she felt unsafe. The phenomena was unceasing, with it clear to her by this point that much of the activity seemed to centre on the attic of the house. In addition to hearing footsteps and other inexplicable noises, she also discovered a strange substance seeping from a crack on the kitchen ceiling. It was oozing and foul-smelling, and would return whenever she wiped it away. Determined that there had to be a rational explanation for it, and for the noises also, Jackie, in a moment of great courage, climbed up and opened the hatch to the attic. Poking her head through the hole, she allowed her eyes to adjust to the darkness. The faint outline of objects, an abandoned packing crate, the wooden rafters of the house, began to come into focus. Then, when she turned her eyes to the far corner of the attic, she supposedly saw something else. The disembodied face of the old man she had seen on her son's bunk bed, floating, hovering several feet above the floor, bereft of limbs and a torso, lunging straight towards her. In her panic, Jackie lost her footing and fell, after which she struggled to clamber back up and replace the loft hatch. She never did locate the source of the odd liquid. However, later on, a sample was able to be taken and sent to a laboratory. It is said that upon analysis, it was determined this was human blood plasma with a high copper and iodine content, and it was of male blood. Terrified of the man in the attic, Jackie began sleeping in the front room with her 2 children. Together, she rationalized they would be safer. Even so, she still heard the footsteps and even the sound of heavy breathing as she tried to rest. For those who knew, it was becoming increasingly obvious that Jackie wasn't coping. Persistent in wanting to help her friend and neighbor, Susan gave Jackie the contact details of a parapsychologist she had seen on a local television program. His name was Dr. Barry Taff, and at the very least, so Susan told her, he would take her story seriously. Eventually, Jackie made the call, and Dr. Taff, along with his team, was invited into the San Pedro house on the 8th of August, 1989. By that time, Dr. Taff had investigated well over 2,000 cases, his most notable being the haunting of Doris Bither, a woman from Culver City, California, whose horrific experiences went on to inspire the 1982 horror film The Entity. With him, he brought Barry Conrad, a television cameraman who had shot over 5,000 news and feature stories, and Jeff Wheatcraft, a once elementary school teacher, now photographer. Together, they set about filming the house and interviewing Jackie and her neighbour about their experiences. Discussing their meeting in the 1997 documentary, Jeff Wheatcraft explained how he was initially very skeptical of Jackie and her experiences. He was, in his own words, very doubtful that anything like this would actually occur, that anybody would see it. As can be imagined, Jackie's recollection of the disembodied head in the attic was especially unbelievable to Jeff, and so he was curious about seeing the attic for himself and volunteered to go up there and take some photographs. It was, so Jeff relayed in his interview, a very small attic. There was nothing up there and no place for anyone to hide or attempt to pull a prank. Even so, as he walked around, he is said to have immediately felt as though something was watching him. He felt very uneasy and had to keep looking back to see if there was anyone behind him. Prompted by his fellow investigators, he turned his camera over his shoulder to see if he could capture anything. As Jeff described in 1997, it was dark, totally dark. I fired first, I fired second, and just as I fired into the third frame, something pulled this camera from my hands. Below, everyone heard him cry out. According to Jackie, he was shaking and pale as he clambered down through the hatch, his camera gone. A moment to catch his breath and grab a torch, and Jeff returned to the attic to find his camera. Sensationally, when he did find it, it was in 2 pieces. The lens disconnected and in one corner of the attic, and the body lying upside down with the lens port straight down in a box in the other corner. How that had happened, he had no idea. And so the investigative team had experienced their first taste of the San Pedro Haunting. Whilst exploring the attic, Jeff also reported feeling a force on his back. He described it as being a bony-handed push. Then, when below, the team and Jackie heard noises on the ceiling. They were loud, pounding sounds that, remarkably, were recorded by the team. Knowing that there was no one in the attic, all were thoroughly unsettled. Even more so when Jackie, reaching to close the hatch, claimed that it was grabbed out of her hand. When Jeff pushed his head through the hole in the ceiling for a final glance about the space, he supposedly saw 3 flashes of light, and then a black mass. There was, he stated in his 1997 interview, something moving in the darkness that was around the same size as 3 guys standing. Intriguingly, when Jeff later developed his photographs, he seemed to have caught one of the flashes of light on film. By the time they left that night, the investigative team were utterly shocked. They had, as their later interviews revealed, not expected to encounter much, let alone all that they did within the space of a few short hours. As for Jackie, she was less impressed. Speaking about it in 2012, she expressed that the team were more interested in their proof than they were her. In her own words, "To me it was my life, and to them it was making a movie." The way she saw it, they came and riled the entity up, then left her alone to live with it. And yet, as is illustrated in the earlier 1997 documentary, which was produced by one of the team members, Barry Conrad, the team remained in contact with Jackie for some time to come, with Jackie reaching out to them whenever there was a new development in the case. And so, for Barry Conrad and Jeff Wheatcraft at least, the 8th of August was not the last time they visited the San Pedro house. Less than a month later, on the 4th of September 1989, the pair were essentially summoned to the house late at night when Jackie phoned Barry in a fit of fear. The haunting had progressed yet again. According to Jackie, she heard moaning and voices in the attic. Objects were being thrown across the room, and the kids' toys were being levitated off the ground. She was ready to jump in her truck and drive until it ran out of gas, because she had no money at that time. She just wanted to get as far away from the house as possible. In short, she had reached her breaking point. Racing to the property, Jeff and Barry brought a friend who had been with them at the time of Jackie's call along also. His name was Gary, and once they arrived at the house, he and Jeff volunteered to enter the attic and confirm once and for all whether or not there was something up there. It was approaching 1 a.m. and the pair climbed up through the hatch, leaving Jackie, her neighbor Susan, and Barry Conrad below. The two men cooled down to confirm that there was nothing untoward in the attic. Nowhere for anyone to hide, and little up there at all, aside from a small grey packing crate. And yet, as they walked about, Jackie, Susan, and Barry heard something peculiar. According to Barry's testimony, there was a sound in my left ear. It just sent chills down my spine, and it sounded like someone snapping their fingers. All three heard the same sound, and frightened as they were, immediately called for Gary and Jeff to come back down, convinced that whatever was terrorizing the house was no longer in the attic. It was then that all hell broke loose. A scream, and for Jeff Wheatcraft, everything went black. As he and Gary approached the hatch, he is said to have been suddenly yanked back. Scrambling to respond to the sound, Gary turned and looked for his friend. With the torch gone, along with Jeff, he could not see anything, and so, with only a camera in hand, raised it and started to take photographs, so as to use the light of the flash to see. What he saw in the flashlight was horrific. Jeff, with a blank and confused expression on his face, hanging from the rafters. As Barry Conrad summarized in the 1997 documentary, Jeff Wheatcraft was physically attacked in this attic on September 4th, 1989 by an invisible force that actually pulled him up onto a nail protruding from a rafter beam and actually tried to strangle him to death. As the others called and cried out below, Gary rushed to aid his friend, struggling to bend the nail upon which he had been hung so as to free him. Somehow there was a clothesline cord around his neck, twisted into a sailor's knot and hung over the nail. Fortunately, Gary was able to release him and get him out of the attic. Speaking about it later, he told how he was convinced that had he not been there to get him down, Jeff would have died in that attic. As for Jeff, the footage filmed that night shows him visibly distressed, sweating and with a red mark all around his neck. He simply couldn't explain how he ended up on the nail and with the clothesline around his neck. And so the San Pedro Haunting had reached a tremendous climax. Deemed to be no longer safe to remain in the house, the team along with Jackie fled soon afterwards. For Jackie and her children, aside from visits to reclaim their possessions, their residency at the house was over. Jackie moved some 300 miles away from San Pedro, thinking that the distance would nullify the haunting. It, however, did not. In fact, according to her testimony, it did not even serve to dullien it. Living in a trailer in Weldon, California, the activity followed her, with the strange lights and noises that had plagued her previous home being sighted and heard again by her and her new neighbors. Jackie has even claimed that on one occasion, after she saw an eerie black shape floating in the hallway, a bedspread caught fire in her daughter's bedroom. And so, whilst the majority of the haunting took place in San Pedro, it is incorrect to say that the story ended there. Rather, Jackie and the investigative team continued to collect evidence, even claiming that they had conducted a Ouija board session during which the entity revealed its identity. He was the ghost, supposedly, of a man murdered in the San Pedro harbor. His dislike of Jeff Wheatcraft, it is said, was due to his resemblance to his unpunished killer. Despite attempts to identify this alleged victim, with Dr. Barry Taff pointing to a 28-year-old man called Herman Hendrickson, whose body was discovered floating in the harbor in 1930, nothing concrete has ever been proven. Today, Jackie Hernandez, so it seems, is finally free of the haunting. On occasion, she still speaks of what happened to her, with her, Barry Conrad, and Gary appearing on television in 2012 to discuss it, and Barry publishing a book in 2009. Throughout the 1990s, she, oftentimes in the company of Barry, also did a circuit of television talk shows being featured on the likes of The Joan Rivers Show and Vicky. For the most part, their story is remarkably consistent and well documented. And herein lies what can be said to be the most peculiar part of this entire case. The events of the San Pedro Haunting seem to be straight out of a horror movie, and yet, unlike so many other paranormal cases of this caliber, there was no movie made. There was the very comprehensive 1997 documentary, but nothing else, which is a complete contrast to the 1974 Entity case and nearly every other sensational haunting of the time, including the Amityville Horror and anything involving Ed and Lorraine Warren. And so the crutch argument of skeptics everywhere that those involved falsified paranormal activity so as to make money does not seem to apply easily in this case. Even when one assesses some of the claims made by Jackie herself that Barry Conrad's treatment of her was at times uncompassionate and driven by making a movie and not helping her, there is little to discredit the underlying haunting. Neither she nor Barry have ever disputed the authenticity of their experiences, with the dispute here seeming to have its origins in ethics, and quite possibly a tangled romantic relationship between the pair which has soured over the years. The drama of the living and not the dead. Some of the only criticisms that can be launched at this case lie in minor inconsistencies between the 1997 full-length documentary and the considerably shorter 2012 Paranormal Witness episode which dealt with the case. Details which were not present in earlier accounts seem to have been added so as to embellish a story which truly did not need embellishment. For example, that during Jackie's first interview with Dr. Taff and his team, the power went out. This was not mentioned in the 1997 documentary, even though the detail seems sensational enough to have made the cut. Additionally, Jackie's ex-husband Al is presented as some sort of arch-skeptic who never believed Jackie's claims. Again, this is not mentioned in 1997, and in fact there are even hints that Al was privy to some of the early activity in the house. Could it be that these are genuine inconsistencies that hint at a broader hoax? Or is it the case that the producers of the 2012 episode wanted Jackie's story to fit some sort of preconceived narrative, with Al being guided to play a role that was never his? It is difficult to conclude that a brief overview episode filmed so many years later has more credibility than a more contemporary and full-length examination of the case that was produced by someone so intimate to its details. That is not to say that we should ignore these issues, only that when compared to many other similar cases of paranormal activity, the San Pedro Haunting stands out in terms of credibility. Indeed, from what can be discerned, most attempts at debunking this case are weak and resort to cherry-picking minor elements that do little to address the phenomena as a whole. And so, in many ways, it seems as though Jackie Hernandez's alleged experiences have left skeptics scared and desperately clinging on to anything which may help to discredit the happening. They appear skeptical purely because they are skeptical. For example, one of the chief arguments is to defame Jackie. The classist approach is to point out that because she was poor, she had to be making it up for the money. Others have espoused the classic hysterical woman thesis, that she was an incompetent mother with mental issues, despite the fact that in all her interviews she comes across as very coherent and alert, an accusation which thus belongs in medieval times and has no validity when associated with a hard-working mother who spent her evenings studying so as to better herself and provide for her 2 young children. In this way, the San Pedro Haunting is a rarity, not merely for the violence that was reported, but for the way in which it has been handled by those who experienced it, leaving us, the onlookers, with very little to say other than sometimes things truly cannot be explained. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing for more of the paranormal if you are not already. Also, once again, thank you to Blissy for sponsoring this episode. Don't forget, if you are interested in getting 30% off their silk pillowcases, you can find a link to my discount code in the description. And if you cannot wait until my next video, why not watch the one suggested on screen now? Until next time,